here's what's coming up on your horizon. Well, despite some good summer rains, parts of Oklahoma are still dangerously dry. Today, we're going to focus on our climate and the people it often affects the most, our state's farmers. We travel to the National Weather Center for the inaugural Ag Weather Symposium.
Our purpose is to produce food for the nation and for the world, as we're told. And so we take that very seriously, so anything that reduces that ability or inhibits that ability is very difficult.
We'll visit with Oklahoma's state climatologist and ask him,
well, Secretary, we've had some good rains here, but are we out of the drought?
And we look at work underway at one of our nation's 7 climate hubs in El Reno, Oklahoma.
The first part is changing the way you look at the situation, the way what your expectations are as to what's going to come, because right now every year is different.
Stay with us for Oklahoma Horizon.
Oklahoma Horizon is made possible by the Oklahoma Department of Career and Technology Education.
Oklahoma's investment in career tech provides more than nationally recognized technology education and training. It produces solid financial returns for the state's economic future. Oklahoma Career Tech, elevating our economy.
And the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry, helping good people grow good things. And now, from the Career Tech Studios in Stillwater, here's your host, Rob McClendon.
Hello everyone, thanks for joining us here on Horizon. Well, in many ways, a farmer's or rancher's job is not that different than any other business person, except in one key area, and that's the weather. Ag producers' fortunes are as tied to the weather as they are the soil. And for ranchers and farmers here in the Southern Plains, the last 4 years have been exceedingly difficult. Here is Sunup TV's Lyndall Stout.
On the heels of the toughest wheat crop outcome in more than a half century, just in time for planting season, it's time to talk weather.
We're seeing much more erratic wheat yields across the state. We've seen devastation to our cattle herds, and so folks are really looking at those weather patterns to try to get a handle on what they can expect.
The first ever Oklahoma Ag Weather Symposium, bringing together producers, commodity leaders, scientists, and extension experts.
That's why we figured it'd be good to come to the National Weather Center to maybe look at some of the data and some of the predictions that they're going to have out for us today. So producers can maybe kind of plan and see what they're up against, maybe long term, even the next 5 to 10 years.
Wow, the weather, has been anything but predictable except for the drought.
OSU's wheat genetics and breeding expert Brett Carver and other scientists say these prolonged conditions translate to valuable research and insight.
This has given us an opportunity to select for drought resistance that we have not had the opportunity before. And one of the interesting things about last year was we just had drought. We didn't have all these other factors that interfered with drought, and so we could concentrate on how the plant was responding to the lack of water.
In his area, Carver believes producers are more open to seeking a number of management solutions to weather challenges. Case in point, producer David Gamble of Cotton County, who is always adapting.
We'd had a disaster the year before, and so we fertilized for a good crop and put herbicide and fungicide one year because the crop looked so good, and then the drought would kick back in, and then the late freezes would kick in 2 of those years, and we'd still lose the crop.
Gamble's also exchanging ideas here with fellow farmers.
We look for how other producers have handled it, and we also come here to listen to the weather experts and maybe get some hope that we're nearly to the end of it.
The overall message, weather is complex, and there are no simple answers.
Yeah, I'm just going to give one angle of it, and that's through genetic improvement, but there are many other ways to do that, and hopefully they'll understand how all those combine and come together to make wheat production and agriculture production in the state so much more successful.
And I think everybody's experience from the different regions of the state are going to be different, and so I think it gives everybody else perspectives from maybe different producer approaches in those regions as to some of the things that they're doing with it that they might not necessarily be dealing with in their own regions.
And whether we're at the end of our drought or not, we'll examine that a bit later in our show. But I do want to continue with the impact drought is having on Oklahoma agriculture. Joining me now is our Courtney May.
Drought can take both a financial and emotional toll on farmers. And that is the story we heard from a panel of ag producers at this year's Weather Symposium.
It's been a rough 4 years for farmers in Oklahoma. Roger Fisher grew up hearing stories of the Dust Bowl and now has an idea of the struggles his family faced.
For 60 days, we had temperatures over 100 with winds just howling every day. So that's one of the my most vivid memories of the drought. Getting up and it would still be blowing in the morning, and it's quite discouraging to wake up and the wind still be blowing and dealing with that. It's one thing to hear about it, but to live and to feel it and to live it on the farm is that's very difficult. Also knowing that it affects your livestock and the crops. They just cannot stand up to that kind of adversity.
Fisher was one of 3 producers who spoke at the Ag Weather Symposium, all from different parts of the state, but with similar problems.
2011 was the first year we didn't harvest anything for about 20 years. So it was a difficult lesson to learn, but we started working on efficiencies.
We ended up cutting back by or reducing our herd by about 50% if you combine both 2011 and 2012. And in 2013, we started to restock and have increased to about what I would consider 75% of average.
Our purpose is to produce food for the nation and for the world, as we're told. And so we take that very seriously. So anything that reduces that ability or inhibits that ability is very difficult.
But for every dark cloud, there are some silver linings.
Reduced cattle numbers have helped or been part of a driving factor of increased prices. So today I'm actually probably more profitable with less cows than I was prior to the drought with more cows because of prices. So I see that as a tremendous opportunity.
It's caused us to focus more on maximizing efficiencies, minimizing unneeded inputs that we can do with, and to be adaptive, to be aware of what's going on. We have to be better marketers and make better choices as we go forward for efficiency.
But it's still not easy. Despite recent rainfall, the drought is so devastating. Recovering from it takes time.
It's almost unbelievable. We had 4 to 6 inches of rain in the June-July period there, and we still have dry ponds. We have some ponds with 0 water.
Yet all these farmers share a resilience that keeps them going back to their fields.
Now, while good soaking rains can turn around a farmer's fortune almost immediately, it's a different story with cattle. When pastures dried up in 2011, many ranchers sold off more cattle than they might have otherwise, and it takes a while to build back a herd.
So what could that mean then for consumers?
Well, if you grilled steaks or hot dogs this summer, you might have noticed that prices increased. According to the United States Department of Agriculture, beef and pork prices have climbed more than 11% since last summer.
All right. Thank you so much, Courtney.
You're welcome, Rob.
Now, when we return, we'll look at drought from a historical perspective.
You're watching Oklahoma Horizon, featuring some of the good things that are happening in the great state of Oklahoma.
So while this drought may seem like an eternity for Oklahoma farmers, it in fact is just a blink of the eye in the long lens of history. If you will, take a look at this timeline. Now, using the paleoclimate record, this shows every drought we've experienced in the last 1,000 years. Now, where the lines drop down below, those are years of drought. When it's up above, well, those are the rainy years. But I first want you to concentrate on the last 200 years. Now, what you see right here is the latest drought, and it's really just barely noticeable. Now, moving down the timeline, you can see the even longer stretch without rain we had in the 1950s, as well as here in the 1930s, and that was the dirty years of the Dust Bowl, which not only wrecked farms across western Oklahoma, but also forced many people to leave the state. but it certainly wasn't the first time a drought has driven social change. If you will, take a look at this period from the 1850s through about 1875. Now, over that 25-year span, it got extremely dry in the high plains. So much so, it kind of killed off the cowboy. At that time, huge ranches dominated in both Texas and in western Oklahoma. But as the drought wore on and the grass disappeared, so did the cattle herds and the ranches that supported them. Huge tracts of land were then broken up and sold, many of which became the homesteads that prospered in the early 1900s, where we had more rain. That is, till the drought of the 1930s taught us just how dry it can get here. Now, when you go beyond just recent history, you can see just how common drought can be in this part of the world. Now, while our historical record does not go back that far, tree rings and pollen deposits, well, they just don't lie. And what you'll find are regular little dips in rainfall, some lasting decades, and some like these lasting generations. So while this latest drought is nothing to be laughed about, it's just a baby when compared to some of the stretches of dry weather that hits this part of the world on a regular basis.
Still to come on Oklahoma Horizon, adapting to a drier climate.
We have to figure out what our options are, and that's the job of the Climate Hub.
But first, Oklahoma's state climatologist.
Well, a product of Buffalo, Oklahoma, Gary McManus has seen firsthand the economic impact drought can have. A perspective, he says, he never forgets as our state's climatologist. Our Andy Barth sat down with Gary after he spoke at this year's Ag Weather Symposium.
Well, so Gary, we've had some good rains here, but are we out of the drought?
Well, now some parts of the state are out of drought, especially across southeastern into east central Oklahoma. They've had really good rains throughout, the last 6 to 9 months. So they haven't been in as bad situation as other parts of the state. But unfortunately, most of the state still remains in drought. It's not quite the severity that we've seen over the last few years with these summer rains and late spring rains that we've seen. But that drought does still exist, and it's mostly due to the long-term impacts.
Okay, so what can Oklahoma expect going forward?
Well, August is always hot and dry, it seems like, so it's not a shock that we've entered a hot and dry August period. Now, as we get into the fall, though, that's our secondary rainy season, and as we get later into September, into October, early November, that's generally when we see a higher rate of rainfall and higher amounts. The spring is definitely our rainiest part of the year, but there is a secondary rainy season in the fall. And, if we look at the outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center, they're actually seeing increased odds of a wetter than normal fall, which would be wonderful to continue the drought relief that we've seen over the last few months.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've seen definitely kind of this yo-yo effect when it comes to the drought. And in terms of agriculture, what does this roller coaster effect have on the industry?
Well, it's a lot of chaos for folks trying to determine when they should plant, what they should plant, when they plant, are they actually going to be able to get a crop up? So if you get all your rainfall from, let's say, late May through July, that doesn't really help you if you're wanting to plant wheat in September or October, because you need rains then. And if you want cotton, rains in September or October don't help you when you want to plant later in the next year. So it's just a lot of chaos, and it's hard to determine when it's so variable the way it's been over the last 4 or 5 years, exactly what sort of actions agriculture should take. And that's the worst thing, is not knowing what it's going to do specifically, because you're used to seeing rains in the fall, rains in the spring, a hot summer, a cold winter, and that's really hasn't worked out over the last few years.
Well, and even with those variations in the temperature and the weather, within this tight-knit industry, it doesn't work for everybody at the same time.
Right, exactly. And so you can't, it's very difficult to say, well, this is not working for me, I'm going to switch to something else. Just look at the amount of, cattle loss from the state over the last 4 years. And because we've had really good periods of rain throughout the 4 years, even though we've been in an overall drought situation, but the cattle have not come back. And that's simply because it's been such a chaotic period. You cannot get enough rainfall for a long enough period of time to really have the confidence to build those herds back up.
Well, and you mentioned, we've had some rains in this long-term drought situation, but a long-term drought doesn't mean constant drought.
Right, even during some of our most severe droughts in our history, the 30s drought, the 50s drought, there were periods of really good rains, and that's what we've seen during this 4-year drought cycle. If you look at the eastern half of the state, they've been in and out of drought about half the time. So pretty equal for those folks. If you look at the western half of the state, they've pretty much been in drought for the entire 4-year period. So it does come and go with the rains. But in overall, though, those long-term drought impacts tend to stick around. And so if you get a dry period crop up, you just accelerate right back into drought much more rapidly than you would normally.
Is there any indication that man has had something to do with these drought conditions?
Not just yet. Now, of course, the long-term, what they call climate change, all the assessments and the science do point towards the possibility of droughts increasing in frequency and severity as we go through the next century, really here, through the end of this century, across the southern plains. And we are seeing a long-term drought that we haven't seen for a while, but we've had those long-term droughts in our past. So really to determine, I think, if this is the beginning of something due to climate change, you're just going to have to wait and see what the science looks at as we get into the future and look back at this climate period, this drought period. Was this the beginning of a long-term change to where we had more droughts and more severe droughts? Or is this just another part of our normal drought wet cycle that we've seen in the Great Plains?
Well, looking forward, is there any good news?
The good news is we do have that possibility for fall rainfall and also the possibility for a wetter than normal fall, which would take the drought relief we've seen during the summer, which was very uncharacteristic for Oklahoma, and continue it into the fall months. And then we also have the possibility of an El Nino. Now, if that El Nino is a strong or even a moderate strength El Nino, we could see a wet October through March period, which would continue that drought relief. But if it's a weak one, we might want to watch out for a dry October through March because that does tend to happen if it's a weak El Nino. So first we need to get this El Nino to develop, and then we need it to be a strong El Nino.
All right, well, Gary McManus, thank you so much.
You bet, my pleasure.
Want to share something you've seen here today? Well, all of our episodes are streaming on our YouTube channel at Oklahoma Horizon TV. Or you can subscribe to our weekly free podcasts on iTunes. Well, whether man is the driving force behind climate change is a contentious issue for many. But what has gained rather wide consensus is that our climate is changing, and with it, the communities and industries that are tied to it. Here's our Lisa Hines.
When you're dependent on the weather for your livelihood, like agriculture is, you have to be smart with your land management. In 2013, the USDA's Grazing Lands Research Laboratory in El Reno became one of 7 regional climate hubs for the United States to help farmers and ranchers understand the climate and how to adapt to it. Climate change is a reality.
The fact that the weather's changed, this is what means climate has changed. That's because weather adds up to climate. We can't wait for things to hold still and then adapt. We have to adapt while they're evolving.
Jean Maple-Schneider is with the USDA's Grazing Lands Research Laboratory and says adapting to climate change requires flexibility.
So that's the first part, is changing the way you look at the situation, the way what your expectations are as to what's going to come, because right now every year is different.
And that's what the research at the USDA laboratory is designed to do, to look at how to adapt to our changing climate. Gene Steiner is the director at the laboratory and says they conduct different research experiments based on agricultural needs.
Because there are so many pressures on agriculture with growing populations, the variabilities of our climate, the very rapid dynamics of the economic markets and the agricultural markets, that the farmers are really wanting a different type of information to help them evaluate their risk in a more timely fashion and help them evaluate alternatives.
Like what crops to plant in a drought situation. Jürgen Garbrecht specializes in hydraulic engineering and says they're using the past to look at the future.
As you know, the weather changes from year to year, and the crop productivity, crop production is changing from year to year. We also have decade scale variations where for 10 years it stays wet or dry, like the Dust Bowl years, like the years of 1960s, like the year of 1970s and 80s and 90s where it was a wet period. And we're looking at climate change that is happening now and goes into the future to establish what we are going to be encountering in the future, to establish what kind of conservation program needs will be necessary to mitigate the effect of climate change.
And driving some of the research is the court of public opinion, like the effect of the methane production of cattle. Ken Turner is a research animal scientist and is looking at how much methane grass-fed cattle actually produce.
Part of this is we're looking at the frame size of cattle, small, medium, large, extra large frame cattle in this research, and starting to identify which cattle are more efficient at utilizing the forages and hopefully minimizing their methane output so that we can start breeding these animals then to fit this and be productive in this environment.
But according to research animal scientist Jim Neal, it's not a quick study.
So I think that we need to keep in mind that this is a long-term research project, and again, we're trying to collect data that gives us something to go off of as far as when we think about greenhouse gases and climate change.
As a regional climate hub, the laboratory helps connect local farmers and ranchers with the right information for their needs. Research soil scientist Patrick Starks.
What we're charged with is getting the technology out there in the hands of somebody like NRCS or Crop Scouts or somebody like that who can then take that information and answer the questions for them. But we can certainly direct them to the research, and probably the people they need to get in contact with.
With the help of partners like Clay Pope, a consultant working with USDA to help get the word out.
We're working with Redlands Community College and with the USDA Climate Hub for the Southern Plains here at Fort Reno to try to help build together partnerships, to try to bring people together, to try to do things where we can have all the different pieces of the puzzle when we're talking about climate change brought to one place, provide that table, help assemble those pieces, hopefully give us a little bit better picture about what we're looking at for the future, what tools producers need to have to adapt to climate change. Are there some mitigation strategies that we can look at? What questions don't we know the answers to? And quite frankly, what other questions should we be asking?
A tall order, but one Schneider says will happen.
We have to figure out what our options are. And that's the job of the Climate Hub, is to help facilitate that development and make sure that information is available to everyone who's reaching out for it.
And Schneider says what she needs most is to hear from producers out there what is working for them and what isn't, so she can spread the word to everyone in the region.
You can keep up with us throughout the week. Just head to okhorizon.com, where you can see more of any of our stories, read our reporters' behind-the-scenes blogs, see what others are saying about us on Twitter, and face the facts with our regular updates. So reach out and touch us anywhere and anytime. Finally today, probably no food better signifies summer than watermelon, and no Oklahoma town more identifies with the summer treat than Rush Springs. So we sent our Courtney May to their annual Watermelon Festival.
This is the best watermelon I've ever tasted.
And there's plenty of it at this year's Watermelon Festival. And Arts and Crafts Chairman Rhonda Keenan says this day is a game changer for Rush Springs business owners.
Our little town is a town of 1,200 people, and our merchant here, they make more on this one day than they do the whole rest of the year.
With more than 27,000 people attending this year's festival, Chairman Mike Zerlin says the festival creates opportunities for everyone.
As you can see, it brings thousands of people to town and brings a lot of income into our local businesses and especially our growers.
Grower Glenn Price has been involved in the watermelon industry his entire life.
Well, I was raised on a watermelon farm. My dad was actually gone for about 4 days when I was born because he was peddling watermelons.
Both Price and his brother attended OSU and were instrumental in developing the seedless watermelons. But no worries, there's still plenty of seeds to be spit. At this year's festival, 2014 Watermelon Queen, Kaylee Large.
I wanted to carry on the tradition of my town, and of coming to the festival and
represent my town well and everything, and invite everyone to come.
Y'all ate some watermelon yet? A slice of success, Keenan says, gives the town hope for a brighter tomorrow.
The festival is sort of our opportunity to keep ourselves focused on the future.
Daddy, I want that.
Next time on Oklahoma Horizon, the role Oklahoma exports play in our economy.
Exports are a very important part of our economy, mostly because they help generate wealth. The products and the goods that we sell to people outside of the state of Oklahoma bring in money to Oklahoma.
Exporting Oklahoma on Oklahoma Show over the Heartland, Oklahoma Horizon. Well, we are out of time. I'm Rob McClendon. Thanks for watching. See you back here next week.
Thank you for watching Oklahoma Horizon.